Each year, we gather here in Dublin to solemnly mark Holocaust Memorial Day. We commemorate the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators, and we also pay tribute to the other persecuted minorities and victims of Nazi atrocities. The music this evening will be provided by Conor Shiel on clarinet, accompanied by Maria Guerin on keyboard. I now invite our host, Oisin Quinn, Lord Mayor of Dublin, to welcome you.
Survivors of the Holocaust, descendants of survivors of the Holocaust, Minister Shatter, Chief Justice, ambassadors, distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Lord Mayor of Dublin, I'm privileged to be hosting Holocaust Memorial Day 2014 today in the round room of the Mansion House on behalf of the people of Dublin. An annual event held every January, it is a very important date in the city's calendar. It is a date to remember the suffering of those who have gone before us and also to reflect on the pain still being inflicted on man throughout the world. This Memorial Day is held in January to mark the date of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1945. I've heard stories from the older generation of Irish people who remember seeing the photographs in the newspapers following the liberation and their shock at what they saw. It was hard to believe what man could do to his fellow man, but in remembering it here today, we ensure the pain is not forgotten and lessons are learned from history. In particular, I would like to welcome this evening survivors and descendants of survivors of the Holocaust who have made Dublin and Ireland their home. You are part of our community and we are happy to call you one of us. My thanks from the people of Dublin to Holocaust Education Trust Ireland for their hard work in organising today's event and for educating about the Holocaust and its consequences. Thank you.
The Department of Justice and Equality has supported Holocaust Memorial Day in Ireland since its inception in 2003. This event provides an opportunity to cherish the memory of those who perished and to reflect on the consequences and lessons of the Holocaust. It also provides a platform for combating intolerance and Holocaust denial. I now invite Mr. Alan Shatter, TD, Minister for Justice, Equality and Defence, to address us. He will speak on remembrance.
We meet tonight, as we do the same time every year, to remember the 6 million Jewish people, men, women and children who died in the Shoah, and also the other victims of the barbarism and inhumanity of Nazi Germany, the Roma and Sinti communities, Slavs, gay men, disabled persons, Jehovah's Witnesses and dissidents who were murdered. We remember the obsessive genocidal objective of Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Rudolf Hess, Adolf Eichmann, and all of those who were dedicated to the elimination of European Jewry and the active complicity of their many collaborators from states across Europe who assisted the Nazis to achieve their evil goal. We remember the Nazis murdered over 1.5 million children, and in extinguishing their lives and those of their parents, extinguished never to be conceived nor born uncountable future generations. We remember that on average on each day of the Second World War, 3,000 Jews were murdered. But that does not tell the full story, as that average would not have been achieved without increasing the efficiency of the industrial killing machine's genocidal extermination. Even when they were losing the war, the Nazis intensified their mass killing of Jews, so driven were they by their aim of turning to ashes Jewish civilization. For European Jewry in mainline Europe, the entirety of the 1939-45 period is a period of unimaginable horror and terror. It is right in this first month of 2014 that we remember that January 1944, just 70 years ago, marked for the Jewish people the start of another catastrophic year, whilst it also laid the foundations for the war's ultimate end with an Allied victory. On the 3rd of January 1944, Russian troops reached the former Polish border, and the 6th of June 1944 was D-Day, when Allied troops landed in Normandy. Tragically for the Jewish people, these events did not deter, but spurred on implementation of the Nazis' final solution. 70 years on, we remember that in 1944, the industrial killing of Jews in Auschwitz-Birkenau increased to 10,000 human beings each day. We remember that 1944 is the year of the deportation of over 400,000 Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz, the year when some 15,000 French Jews, including children, were rounded up and transported, also mainly to Auschwitz. It is the year when the Lodz Ghetto, the last ghetto in Poland, was liquidated, with 60,000 Jews sent to Auschwitz, and on the 4th of August 1944, Anne Frank and her family were arrested by the Gestapo in Amsterdam, sent to Auschwitz, and Anne and her sister later transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where Anne died of typhus on the 15th of March 1945, tragically shortly before the war's end. We also remember that 1944 is the year when a Red Cross delegation visited Theresienstadt concentration camp. The visit took place in June 1944, after the Nazis had carefully prepared the camp and also its Jewish inmates for the visit. We remember that following that visit, the Red Cross incredibly published a favourable report. In remembering the genocidal atrocities committed, it is also right that we remember those people of courage and conviction, the righteous among nations who placed their lives at risk to save thousands of Jewish lives. 1944 is the year when the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg saved nearly 30,000 Hungarian Jews, and Oskar Schindler saved 1,200 Jews by moving them from Plazow labor camp in Krakow, Poland, to his hometown of Brunlitz. It was also in July of 1944 that the first concentration camp was liberated, Mariinek, by Russian troops, where 360,000 had been murdered. More liberations were to follow. Towards the end of October 1944, use of the gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau ended, and Hitler ordered the destruction of the crematoria on the 25th of November 1944. At the end of that year, at the end of 1944, the Allies were posed on the Rhine, the Danube, and the Vistula. The end of the war and the defeat of Hitler was in sight. It was a time of hope, but too many, not yet liberated, did not survive to see their hopes fulfilled. Irish Jewry escaped the Shoah. However, the then Irish Jewish community was not forgotten by those who so meticulously planned the final solution. It was numbered and expressly prescribed for elimination on a map prepared by Adolf Eichmann that can today be viewed in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, and perhaps has been so viewed by some of you here. It is right that we remember that many of those from the Jewish community present here this evening, and the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren which form part of the Irish Jewish diaspora across the world, would never have been born had the Allied forces not prevailed. It was, I believe, for too long easily forgotten that 60,000 citizens of the neutral Irish Free State joined the Allied forces to fight against tyranny during World War II, amongst them over 5,000 who deserted our own defence forces to do so. I believe that the legislation I brought before the Dáil last year, and which was enacted with the full support of my Cabinet colleagues and the members of both houses of the Oireachtas, to extend to all of those who deserted an amnesty and forgiveness by the state for their desertion, was a long overdue recognition by this state of the important role that they played. As Minister for Defence, I believe it is right that desertion by any member of our defence forces be treated as a serious offence. but it's also right and just that we finally recognised the unprecedented extenuating circumstances of that time, the morality of their actions, and expressed our gratitude. Although this gesture on behalf of the state came too late for most of the war veterans, I know it's of importance to their families and also to their descendants. We remember also the survivors who have carried through their lives the burden of the terrible memories of what they saw and experienced, acknowledge the courage of those who have told their stories and have had the strength to bear witness, so that we know today of the horrors of a past which must never be repeated. Among us tonight, we are privileged to have Tommy Reichenthal, Jan Kaminski, and Inga Radford. I want to thank each of you for your generosity, for sharing your experiences with the wider community, and also thank Susie Diamond, who I understand cannot be with us. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the survivors for their bravery in reliving unimaginable memories for the good of others, and also for ensuring that today's generations both know and understand the evil they experienced in the early years of their lives. We live in a complex and difficult world in which historical fact can be distorted and contaminated and become an inconvenient truth should it challenge a contemporary political narrative in which some have a vested interest. Holocaust denial is the favourite sport of some, in particular in Europe and in the Middle East. It is the first cousin of those who will see Jews for no reason other than they are Jewish as legitimate targets for hate speech and random violence, and of extremists who would, if they could, bring about a second Holocaust by the extermination of the 6 million Jews who today are citizens of the State of Israel. As Europeans and European nations, we must give no comfort to those who express such views, engage in such conduct, or have any such objective. We should also have a greater understanding of legitimate concerns aroused by threats made to eliminate the Israeli state, and by political campaigns sponsored by states or others to delegitimize its existence. It is right that we remember that Israel declared its independence in 1948, its existence as a state having been first sanctioned and endorsed by United Nations resolution, and that a majority of that state's citizens in 1948 were Jews who likely would have perished in Europe had they not resided there in the preceding decades, and remnants of European Jewry who survived the Holocaust. It is also right that we remember that too many in a position of political leadership turned their backs on the Jews of Germany during the early years of Nazi repression and utterly failed to address the peril in which they found themselves. Hitler almost succeeded in his objective to make Europe Juden-free. Today's Europe, political leaders should be conscious of Europe's history and past failures and be slow to endorse or advocate that any part of the Middle East be rendered entirely Juden-free as the primary focus of any conflict resolution process. The tragic truth, of course, is that today many parts of that region are in fact Juden-free, and the Jewish communities that flourished for countless generations no longer exist. In Ireland, it is right that we remember that the doors of this state were kept firmly closed to Jewish families who desperately sought to come here from Germany for sanctuary during the Nazi terror of the 1930s. They substantially remained closed, even after the concentration camps were liberated and emaciated survivors staggered traumatized through the open gates. We recall with moral revulsion the advices in December 1938 of Charles Bewley, the then Irish Minister Plenipotentiary in Berlin and a rabid anti-Semite, to the then Irish government. Endorsing the Nazi narrative, supporting the Führer's objective of, and I quote, the elimination of the Jewish element from the public life of Germany, and all of the restrictions imposed on German Jewry, he advised the then Irish government that, and again I quote, the Jewish problem was best left to be dealt with by individual governments, stating that not only in Germany, but in every state where they exist in any quantity, the Jews are regarded as an alien body. Stating that every state which has experience of Jews, including those with Catholic clergymen at their head, finds it necessary to introduce similar special measures restricting their activities, he stated he was not aware of any case of deliberate cruelty on the part of the German government towards Jews, and he complained of the complete want of proportion in the importance ascribed to events in Germany by British and Irish papers then critical of Jewish persecution. As Europeans, we have an obligation to ensure the Shoah is not denied, falsified, trivialized, or relativized in a time when the e-book version of Hitler's Mein Kampf is a bestseller. We condemn the recent falsifying remarks of Sanda Zakali, the director of the new government-created historical institute misnamed Veritas in Hungary, describing the 1941 deportation of Jewish people to Hungary as, and again I quote, a police action against aliens. It was in fact in July and August of 1941 the rounding up and deportation to German-held territory in Ukraine of about 18,000 foreign-born Jewish people who had sought refuge in Hungary at the outbreak of the Second World War. Most of them were included among the more than 23,000 Jewish people murdered by the Nazis at the end of 1941. We must always recognize and act upon our sacred duty to challenge those who still propagate the endemic anti-Semitic hatred and prejudice cultivated in parts of Europe during past centuries, which resulted in the unimaginable genocidal obscenity of the Holocaust. Today we remind ourselves that the Shoah was the legal poisonous fruit of anti-Semitism. We recall that it was an unfolding constellation of evil events, from the Nuremberg laws of 1933 to the ghettos and the slave labor, and then ultimately the death camps. The unfolding evil of the Shoah began not in the death camps, but with anti-Semitic hate speech. As Europeans, we must confront the rise in anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, homophobia, and hate crimes. In Europe, the economic crisis has spawned new parties and revitalized pre-existing parties of the extreme right, whose anti-Semitic and racist rhetoric is both corrosive and dangerous. For example, in Greece, we have Golden Dawn. In Hungary, Jobbik. In France, Front National. In Bulgaria, Attica, the Bulgarian National Party, and in Britain, the British National Party and UKIP. Unfortunately, some of these are no longer on the fringes of political life, and there is growing concern over the level of support they will attract in the forthcoming European parliamentary elections. This legitimate concern is partly fueled and facilitated by the failure of governments and mainstream parties in Europe to confront and denounce the prejudice they peddle, and by their partial embrace of a xenophobic agenda. It is not enough that we remember the Holocaust. We must also remember the moral imperative to unequivocally repudiate the reprehensible rhetoric of those who contaminate our political discourse and attempt to inflame dangerous prejudice. Central to the values of the European Union are the principles of democracy, equality, and human rights. During Ireland's presidency of the European Union as Minister for Justice and Equality, together with the extraordinary and dedicated public servants in my Justice Department, I worked to ensure there was a greater focus by the European Union on the taking of coordinated action at European level in this area. We initiated a debate on a working mechanism to better support the protection of fundamental rights and the rule of law in Member States. Along with several other Member States and the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, Ireland is involved in a cooperative project to identify a methodology which will enable us to measure adherence to the rule of law and our shared EU values across all Member States. I believe that doing so has a vital role to play in protecting the fundamental rights of all EU residents and in tackling extreme intolerance across the European Union. The need for this has been starkly illustrated by a report on anti-Semitism published by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights in just November last. A shocking 76% of Jewish people surveyed across EU member states felt that anti-Semitism has worsened in the past 5 years. Over half of the respondents had encountered first-hand experience of Holocaust denial within the previous year, and 1/3 had suffered some form of anti-Semitic harassment within the previous 5 years. Amongst those surveyed, 29%, almost a third, stated they were considering emigrating from the EU member state in which they and their families were resident. I found none of this surprising in the context of my own personal experience of the racist and prejudiced online commentary which all too frequently results on occasions when I'm personally in the public eye. Today's ceremony is about remembrance, and I firmly believe remembrance must be active, not passive. Remembrance is an act, a deliberate undertaking, and remembering the Shoah must remain a moral duty. That duty requires that we do everything we can to honour the victims of the past by working to prevent similar horrors in the future. Today, we remember those whose lives were taken. We remember those who suffered. We remember those who fought back. We honour the survivors whose strength and bravery helps us in our duty of remembrance. We also acknowledge the pivotal importance of education in relation to the Shoah and of teaching in our schools this dark, shameful chapter in European history. Education is vital to protect, in the face of irrational prejudice, every person's fundamental right to be treated as a moral equal. Striving to counteract forgetfulness in relation to the Shoah requires actively fostering mutual respect and concern for all people. I acknowledge that the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland plays an important role in preserving memory of the Shoah and in promoting equal concern and respect for all persons. It is assisted, as was mentioned, in this important work by financial support from the Department of Justice and Equality, and such support will continue. Faithful to this fundamental moral purpose, we commit ourselves to advancing the universal human rights of all people. We reject words of hate and the denial of historical facts, whose sole objective is to deny to the Jewish people their right to a secure place on this planet without fear of persecution or extermination. We recognize also our obligation to treat others as we wish to be treated, to respect their human rights, and to do what we can to prevent and resolve conflict. We remember the murdered millions who died what the Jewish poet Vyacheslav Zlengel called a garbage death, and say, never again. To the murdered millions who were denied zechut, or the reward of a full life, we solemnly accord zachor, remembrance. And we insist on the essential moral message that preventing new barbarities is not just the responsibility of others, but is the responsibility of each of us, one by one, and all of us together from generation to generation, Lador Vador.
In the year 2000, Ireland was one of over 40 signatories to the Stockholm Declaration, an international milestone in committing governments to commemorating and educating about the Holocaust and for combating racism, anti-Semitism, and ethnic hatred. I now invite Dr. Martin McAleese to read a summary of the Stockholm Declaration.
We, the governments attending the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, recognise that the Holocaust was a tragically defining episode of the 20th century, a crisis for European civilization and a universal catastrophe for humanity. In declaring that the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization, we share a commitment to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and to honour those who stood against it. The horrors that engulfed the Jewish people and other victims of the Nazis must forever be seared in our collective memory. With humanity still scarred by genocide, anti-Semitism, ethnic cleansing, racism, xenophobia, and other expressions of hatred and discrimination, we share a solemn responsibility to fight against these evils and to reaffirm humanity's common aspiration for a democratic and tolerant society free of prejudice and other forms of bigotry.
The impact of the Holocaust on Europe is profound. The Holocaust strengthened Europe's commitment to peace after 2 world wars. I now invite Francis Jacobs of the European Parliament Information Office in Ireland to give his reading.
The Holocaust created a hole in the heart of Europe. 2/3 of its Jewish people had been destroyed. The history of the Holocaust is shared with the people of Europe, and the Holocaust holds a significant place in Europe's public memory. There are challenges in coming to terms with the Holocaust and in developing a common European identity and shared European values. The Holocaust is present in our European psyche, and it is part of our heritage. This has mostly enabled us to adhere to peaceful coexistence for more than 60 years, heeding the universal lessons that the experience of the Holocaust has taught us. "1938 was a very significant year for the Jewish people of Europe. Nazi anti-Semitic policies and restrictions against Jews were intensified. Pressure was put on Jews to leave Germany and German-occupied lands. Hundreds of thousands tried to flee. In July 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt convened an international conference in Évian-les-Bains in France to consider the refugee crisis that had developed. I now invite Maurice Cohen, Chair of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, to tell us about the Évian Conference.
"32 countries were represented at Évian, including Ireland. Most countries said they had no room for Jews and their quotas were already full. One country even stated, 'No Jew is too many.' Out of all the nations present at the Évian conference, none were willing to take in more Jewish refugees. With nowhere to turn, the Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders. The conference was deemed a failure."
In November 1938, the Nazis unleashed a pogrom against the Jews and Jewish property of Germany and Austria. Nazi brown shirts, Hitler Youth, and Nazi sympathizers were eager participants in Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. I invite Tim O'Connor to give his reading.
After years of official harassment of Jews in Nazi Germany, the state-sanctioned violence of the 9th and 10th of November 1938 is seen as the start of the rapid road downhill to the Holocaust. Kristallnacht erupted across Germany and Austria, during which hundreds of Jewish synagogues, homes, schools, and businesses were destroyed and set ablaze. Windows were smashed, leaving the streets strewn with glass. 91 Jews were murdered, and 30,000 Jewish men were thrown into concentration camps. After the destruction, the Jewish communities were fined 1 billion Reichsmark to pay for the damage.
Ireland is outside the Holocaust experience compared to her European neighbours, but we still have direct connections with that dark page in history. I now invite Pat Hines of the Glencree Peace and Reconciliation Centre to give his reading about Ireland during the Holocaust.
One Irish Jewish citizen, Eddie Steinberg, who was married to a Belgian, Wojciech Gluck, perished in Auschwitz along with her husband and baby son, Leon. Thousands of Irish men served in Allied armed forces throughout and during the war, and we know of dozens of captured Irish merchant seamen who refused to collaborate with the Germans, many of whom died in slave labour and concentration camps. Very few Jewish refugees were allowed into Ireland during the 1930s and 40s, but a very small number of Jewish families from Austria and Czechoslovakia received permits to work in the hat and ribbon factories in the west of Ireland, leaving behind families who later perished in the Holocaust.
Holocaust survivor Jan Kamiński was just 10 years old when the Jewish population of his native village in Poland was liquidated in 1942. I now invite his daughter, Jadzia Kamińska, to give Jan's reading on behalf of her father, who is also with us this evening.
I was born Chaim Shul Zibner, the second eldest of 4 children in the town of Bilgoraj in eastern Poland, which is not far from the city of Lublin and the border with Ukraine. About 70 kilometers away, the Nazi death camp of Wojciech was established. At the time, 5,000 Jews lived in Bilgoraj, which was more than half the population of the town. As Nazi killing squads swept through the eastern territories, my family were sent to Wojciech along with the remainder of the Jewish community on the 3rd and 9th of November 1942. At that moment, I became separate from my family and I fled into the forest. It was no longer safe to identify myself as Jewish, and I became Jan Kamiński, surviving the war on the run, hiding in woods, living on farms, and doing odd jobs and living off my wits. Eventually, in July 1944, I linked up with the Russian Army's Polish Corps and became a child soldier in the 21st Artillery Regiment at 12 years of age. After liberation, I spent time in Europe before eventually coming to England and then Ireland. After the war, we learned that the once flourishing Jewish communities of Poland had been utterly destroyed. My entire family had been wiped out. My parents, Suzlem and Mindla, my sisters, Hannah, Matla and Rivka, and my baby brother, whose name is not recorded, had all disappeared. Anti-Semitism still prevailed in Poland and elsewhere, and pogroms against Jews were still taking place. It was impossible to think of rebuilding Jewish life in Poland then. Today there is a modest project of Jewish revival taking place in Bilgoraj, but so far, after nearly 30 years of searching for them, no traces of my direct family have been found.
The Nazis established their first ghetto in Piotrków Trybunalski in October 1939. Subsequently, more than 1,000 Jewish residential districts were created throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. I now invite Owen Keegan, Dublin City Manager, to tell us about the ghettos.
More than 1 million Jews died in the ghettos, which were created in every country occupied by the Germans. They were established in cities and large towns, close to railways, and often near killing sites or death camps. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and Jews who left them without permission were often severely punished and sometimes shot. The brutality, harsh living conditions, and disease added to the death toll. Although there are heroic stories of resistance, most of the ghetto populations were murdered. In the end, all the ghettos created by the Nazis were liquidated, and there were few survivors.
In January 1942, 15 senior Nazi and German government officials attended the Wannsee Conference in a luxurious villa near Berlin to dispassionately discuss the total annihilation of the Jewish people. I now invite Sean O'Faulu, Secretary General of the Department of Education, to give his reading.
At the Wannsee Conference, Reinhard Heydrich asked the participants to endorse the Führer's plans to annihilate the Jews of Europe. Eichmann presented the delegates with a list of the number of Jews living in each European country. Ireland appears on the list with a total of 4,000 Jews. The delegates debated at length who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement of the Jews. They concluded that a more efficient method of murder was necessary, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites in the Eastern Territories from the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killing. Over fine food, brandy and cigars, it took the delegates less than 2 hours to unanimously endorse Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question.
The Nazis employed several methods of systematic murder. I now invite Kevin Manning, history teacher from Malahide Community College, to give his reading.
The Nazis found different ways to murder the Jewish people of Europe. It suited them if they could demonstrate that the Jews had died from natural causes, invariably from brutality, starvation, disease, exposure, and hard labour. These methods were soon expanded by the killing squads operating in the Eastern Territories and by the establishment of purpose-built death camps, specifically to murder Jews by poison gas.
In 2002, the poet Micheál O'Sheill published The Gossamer Wall, Poems in Witness to the Holocaust. I now invite Micheál to read Arrivals from that work.
Arrivals. Clamouring for water, even a handful of snow. By day, the glimpsed places in the dozed night groans are bickering until their wagons slow and crash open in a station's eerie floodlight. Uncanny ordinariness. No baggage, they're told. A dozen SS men with a stony, indifferent air move among the arrivals, questioning how old, healthy or ill, and pointing either here or there. Men won't abandon wives. Together afterward, they're reassured. Some mothers, unreconciled to leaving small children, are soon transferred. Good, they say. Good, just stay with the child. A finger is pointing. Caprices of fate allotted. Frozen silence of lives unseamed and parted.
In his memoir, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl vividly described the Nazi selection process during which the smallest gesture could mean the difference between life and death. I now invite Mary Benotti, former MEP and founding trustee of the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland, to give her reading about the selection process.
He was a tall man who looked slim and fit in his spotless uniform. What a contrast to us, who were untidy and grimy after our long journey. He had assumed an attitude of careless ease, supporting his right elbow with his left hand. His right hand lifted, and with the forefinger of that hand, he pointed very leisurely from left to right. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movement of a man's finger, pointing now to the right, now to the left, but far more frequently to the left.
The Nazis decided that the removal from society of people with disabilities would strengthen and purify German blood. I now invite Brendan O'Connor, broadcaster and editor, to give his reading.
The Nazis considered all people with intellectual and physical disabilities as life unworthy of life and a burden on the state. High school textbooks contained examples of maths problems, calculating the costs of care for people with disabilities compared to the costs of caring for a healthy person. The T4 euthanasia program was initiated to eliminate people with disabilities. Although public outcry, led by Bishop von Galen, halted the T4 euthanasia program in August 1941, it continued clandestinely throughout the war. The machinery of mass murder developed in the course of Action T4 and operated by doctors demonstrated with grim efficiency that it was ready to be applied to others on a far larger scale. It is estimated that the Nazis killed more than 200,000 people with disabilities.
When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler ordered the murder of the Polish intelligentsia. I now invite Dr. Aneta Stepien of the Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies at Trinity College Dublin
to give her reading.
Hitler had declared that Poland was to be totally destroyed, its academically educated and professional classes annihilated, and its population reduced to a state where they were completely demeaned. Tens of thousands of political and church leaders, intellectuals, professionals, and entrepreneurs, landowners, and other Polish elites were murdered or sent to concentration camps. Polish universities, scientific laboratories, schools, museums, and libraries were destroyed. Polish children did not progress beyond elementary school, and thousands were forcibly taken to Germany to be Aryanized and reared as Germans. It is estimated that 3 million Poles were murdered by the Nazis.
Due to their nomadic lifestyle and unwritten history, it is difficult to know the exact number of Romani people who were murdered by the Nazis, but estimates put the figure between 250,000 and 500,000. I now invite Gabi Mantian of the Roma Project at Pavy Point to give her reading about the persecution of the Roma.
Hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti people were rounded up, forced into ghettos, and deported to concentration and death camps. Thousands of Roma were labeled as social and had to wear an identifying black triangle in the camps. As socials were considered to be criminals and useless to the national community. Roma and Sinti died from gassings, starvation, disease, forced labor, and medical experiments.
I now invite the journalist and advocate for social justice and mental health, Dil Wickramasinghe, to tell us about the persecution of homosexuals.
The Nazi arrested thousands of gay men and imprisoned them in concentration camps. They were forced to wear pink triangles on their camp uniforms, and lesbians were forced to wear black triangles. In concentration camps, homosexuals were subjected to harder work, less food, and greater brutality than other inmates. Thousands were put to death. The criminalization and social stigmatization of homosexuals in Europe and in the United States remained in force for many years after World War II. And homosexual survivors of Nazi persecution were not acknowledged as victims of the Holocaust. Some even had to serve the remainder of their sentences, which did not take into account the time they had spent in concentration camps. Few homosexual survivors of the Holocaust have ever told their stories.
When France occupied the German Rhineland in 1919, tens of thousands of black colonial soldiers were deployed to the region. After 1933, the Nazis targeted the hundreds of mixed-race children who were born to German women. I now invite the writer Tabi Medida to tell us about the persecution of black and mixed-race people by the Nazis.
Black people have suffered persecution throughout history. In 1933, the Nazis established Commission Number 3, which was a program that started organizing the forced sterilization of hundreds of children of African ancestry. According to Nazi philosophy, this would preserve the purity of the Aryan population, as the Nuremberg racial laws had stated that black and people of ethnic minorities were considered inferior. By the outbreak of the Second World War, thousands of black, mixed race, and ethnic people had fled Germany, and most of those who remained were murdered.
Many political dissidents actively opposed the Nazis from the earliest days of the regime. I now invite Brendan O'Sullivan, President of the Irish National Teachers Organisation, to give his reading.
The Nazis persecuted thousands of political dissidents and opponents, some for what they did, some for what they refused to do, and some for who they were. The torching of the Reichstag National Parliament building in 1933 gave the Nazis a pretext for brutally suppressing the Communists and later the Social Democrats. They abolished trade unions and cooperatives, confiscated their assets and prohibited strikes. As early as 1933, the Nazis established the first concentration camp, Dachau, as a detention centre for political prisoners.
Although a great many Christians were Nazis, we are also mindful of the many thousands of Christians who were persecuted and murdered for opposing Hitler and for saving Jews. I now invite Sister Stanislaus Kennedy to give her reading about the Christian victims.
In their efforts to eliminate opposition, the Nazis also targeted priests, nuns, teachers, and intelligentsia. They persecuted and murdered thousands of Catholics, Protestants, and others of Christian affiliation. Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis for their refusal to salute Hitler as savior or to serve in the German army. A great number of priests and nuns also saved Jews during the Holocaust. The Quakers worked tirelessly during the early years of the Reich to assist those trying to escape from Hitler's tyranny. There were thousands of righteous Christians and thousands of Christian victims.
I now invite His Excellency Mr. Boaz Modai, the Ambassador of the State of Israel to Ireland, to give his reading.
The final solution was a systematic attempt by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jew in every country of Europe. 6 million Jews, 2/3 of European Jewry, perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of these victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims, but as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all the Jews were victims.
There is a small number of Jewish Holocaust survivors living in Ireland. All of them were children during the time of the Holocaust, and all of them found their way to Ireland by different means. Each of them lost many family members, and each has his or her own personal tale of survival. I now invite Tommy Reichenthal to give his reading.
I'm here today not because who I am, but because what I am. I am a Jew and I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. I was 9-year-old when I was captured by the Nazis along with my mother, grandmother, aunt, brother, and cousin. We were herded into cattle car, and from that moment onwards, we were treated worse than animals. There was no privacy or hygiene. The stench and conditions were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 nights, the cattle train stopped. The doors were open and we were greeted by shouts from the SS with gun at the ready and the barking of their Alsatian dogs. We arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was there from November 1944 until the liberation of the camp in 1945. What I witnessed as a 9-year-old boy is impossible to describe. The starvation, the cruelty of the camp guard, the cold, disease. People were just skin and bone, looked like living skeletons, were walking around slowly, some of them dropping where they fell, never to get up again. They were dying in their hundreds. Their emaciated bodies were fell or thrown into heaps. In front of our barracks, there were piles of decomposing corpses. For many prisoners in Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were too much to bear, and they threw themselves on the electrified barbed wire at night in order to put the end to their misery. We found their corpses there in the morning. 70,000 prisoners of Bergen-Belsen are buried there in mass grave. I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust.
On the 13th of April 1945, reporter and writer Dennis Johnston was one of the first reporters to enter Buchenwald concentration camp just 2 days after it had been liberated. He was wearing a military uniform. I now invite his daughter, writer Jennifer Johnston, to read from her father's work, 9 Rivers from Jordan, the chronicle of a journey and a search.
At one end lay a heap of smoking clothes, amongst which a few ghouls picked and searched for what God only knows. As we entered the long hut, the stench hit us in the face, and a queer wailing sound came to our ears. Along both sides of the shed was tier upon tier of what can only be described as shelves. And lying on these, packed tightly side by side like knives and forks in a chest, were living creatures. Some of them stirring, some of them stiff and silent, but all of them skeletons, with the skin drawn tight over their bones, with heads bulging and misshapen from emaciation, with burning eyes and sagging jaws. And as we came in, those with strength to do so turned their heads and gazed at us, and from their lips came that thin, unearthly sound. Then I realized what it was. It was meant to be cheering. They were cheering the uniform that I wore. They were cheering for the hope that it brought them. We walked the length of the shed and then through another one. From the shelves, feeble arms rose and waved like twigs in a breeze.
Every one of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust was killed because he or she was Jewish. They were teachers, professors, rabbis, economists, academics, doctors, surgeons, nurses, vets, lawyers, engineers, pharmacists, scholars, and students. They were war veterans, policemen, industrialists, peasants, farmers, businessmen, laborers, peddlers, shopkeepers, clerks, and civil servants. They were pensioners, housewives, widows, school children, and babies. We must prevent future generations from thinking of the Holocaust in terms of anonymous, faceless numbers. Each victim has a name. Several people living in Ireland lost cherished family members in the Holocaust. We will now read from the scroll of names, and in this small way, we will honor their memory and give them a personal Irish memorial. I invite pupils of Stratford College, Dublin, Franciscan College, Gormanston, County Meath, Drimnagh Castle CBS, Dublin, and Fingal Community College to read from the scroll of names.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gisela Molnar, Bela Hirschberg, Matthias Hirschberg, Ruchela Orzel, Feivel Orzel, Slasma Urbach, Hirsch Urbach, Tauba Urbach, David Joseph Urbach, Shaul Urbach, Abe Tzvi Urbach, Gitla Freidla, Leah
Rukla Golda
Feigla,
Urbach,
Nuchim Mordechai,
Sarah Urbach, Heel Urbach, Shimon Urbach, Nukim Urbach, Feigla Urbach, Perla Urbach, Primetna Urbach, Moses Klein, Hilda Frenkel, Kurt Frenkel, Walter Frenkel, Herbert Frenkel, Fritz Frenkel, Sigmund
Caroline
Frenkel,
Wolf,
Salomon
Martin
Delmo,
Wolf, Wolfgang Wolf, Sally Wolf, Henrietta Wolf, Rosetta Wolf, Elie Velvel Avisansky, David Philip, Rasha Philip, Leopold Philip, Julia Philip, Dagbert Philip, Louis Philip, Valeria Philip, Rosalia
Geza Suri,
Shaimovich,
Asta
Julius
Michaelovich,
Mayer,
Adela Fries, Bella Fries, Katarina Fries, Agnes Fries, Ezekiel Reichenthal, Katarina Reichenthal, Kalmar Reichenthal, Ilona Reichenthal, Gita Reichenthal, Ibi Reichenthal, Desider Reichenthal, Ferdinand Alt, Renka Alt, Erna Elbers,
Joseph Drexler,
Martha Elbers,
Badriska Drexler, Paul Drexler, Meta Drexler, Bella Perlberg, Irma Popper, Ephraim Naaman, Tzvi Naaman, Haya Zelcher, Israel Zelcher, 5 Zelcher children, Roisa Centnersver, Masha Centnersver, 6 Centnersver children, Fischel Bernholtz, Mrs. Bernholtz,
Lehman
Bernholtz
Naaman,
children,
Mrs. Naaman, Naaman children, Menahum Naaman, Mrs. Naaman, Naaman children, Mordecai Steinbach, Handel Steinbach, Sarah Steinbach, Esther Steinbach, Masha Steinbach, Mare Steinbach, Regina Steinbach, Israel Steinbach, Hinda Steinbach,
Mayor
Hertz Hoffman, Haya Hoffman,
Hoffman children, Zelig Hoffman, Mordecai Hoffman, Baruch Gottlieb, Reutz Gottlieb, Gottlieb children, Rachmiel Shmiovich, Sarah Fremich Shmiovich, Aria Leib Shmiovich, Leah Licho Shmiovich, Rachel Rochelle Shmiovich, Devora Shmiovich, Miriam
Laura
Pollock,
Mattia,
Diet
Ephesia Mattia, Ankisha Mattia, Kalman Rosenthal, Eleonora Rosenthal, Abraham Sustiel, Pauline Sustiel, David Sustiel, Shimon Sustiel, Regina Sustiel, Rafi Sustiel, Martha Sustiel, Shavtai Sustiel, Lucy Sustiel, Moshe Yom Tov Sustiel, Adela
Emmanuel Brudo,
Sustiel, Ageni Sustiel
children,
Brudo,
Heinrich Heimbach, Selma Heimbach, Sigma Zaks, Rivka Zaks, Beryl Zaks, Sissy Zaks, Nachman Zox, Hannah Zox, Aaron Zox, Hannah Sherry, Yoel Dov Zox, Bendit Zox, Leah
Shoshana
Zedek,
Zax,
Gittel
Shayna
Zax,
Zax, Masha Zax, Rosa Zax, Tyler Feige Fachler, David Meyer Fachler, Moshe Fachler, Gela Fachler, Shendel Milechman, Yechiel Milechman, Theo Milechman, Josef Milechman, Happy Grzyb, Haya Milechman,
Musa
Jochebed
Nuta
Milechman,
Fachler, Esther
Chaim
Zacher
Meir
Jakobowicz, Mima Alt Milachman, Levi Fachler, Izzy Fachler, Nathan Fachler, Johanna Karlsberg Sommer, Emil Sommer, Hannah Matla Siebner, Rivka Siebner, Baby Siebner, Mindla Siebner, Sulim Siebner, Frandla Siebner, daughter Frandla, Joseph
Etty
Siebner,
Steinberg,
Scheinler
Leon
Siebner,
Glug, Wojtek Glug, Moshe Tabolicki, Zahawa Tabolicki, Rachel Tabolicki, Hatzkel Abram, Bela Abram, Osa Jose Abram, Sigmund Sel Kohn, Ida Kohn Neuwintersberg, Henrik Herbst, Caroline Herbst Neulf, Elise Herbst, Danny Zimak.
$1,500,000 Jewish children were murdered in the Holocaust. An estimated 20 to 30,000 survived the war in hiding. I now invite the actor Ingrid Craigie to tell us about these hidden children.
After the war, children who had been hidden during the Holocaust discovered that they were the sole survivors of once large Jewish families. Only after 45 years did they begin to tell their stories, which have now become an integral part of the Holocaust narrative. Hidden children were those under the age of 14, many of them babies, whose parents managed to find someone, a non-Jewish person or family, or a Christian institution, with whom their child could live without their Jewishness becoming known. These children were absorbed into Christian families, saying Christian prayers, attending church and school, taking on a Christian name. All of those in hiding had to make daily efforts to hide the fact that they were Jewish. One slip could mean betrayal, arrest, and deportation. Some of these children survived alone, living from day to day with the fear of capture and execution. They spent months in sewers, closets, barns, and forests. Some of them joined the partisans and fought the enemy. They stayed alive. A great many hidden children have been burdened with the guilt of survival because they did not go through the camps. They have been trying to come to terms with their confused, frightening, and lost childhoods. Each one felt the pain of separation, each one trying to remember his mother's face.
Irena Sendler was a young Polish Catholic social worker who saved Jewish children in the Warsaw Ghetto. I now invite Zlata Filipowicz, who survived the war in Sarajevo in the 1990s when she was just a young girl and who wrote her own diary during that time, to give her reading about Irena Sendler.
Irena Sendler was part of an underground operation that helped smuggle Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. She persuaded parents to hand over their children and give them a chance of survival. She was personally responsible for saving the lives of 2,500 Jewish children. With widespread contacts outside the ghetto, Irena and her colleagues managed to smuggle the children out through sewer pipes and underground passageways. Babies and small children were brought to safety by merchants and others who had access to the ghetto, hiding them in trunks, suitcases, or sacks. Children who were old enough to talk were taught to rattle off Christian prayers and mimic other religious behavior. As she found homes for the Jewish children, Irena kept a record of each child's Jewish name and family, as well as the new Christian name and new address. Immediately after the war, Irena handed over the names of the rescued children. Few of the parents of the Warsaw Ghetto survived, but their children did, and they can trace their histories thanks to Irena's meticulous record-keeping.
The timing of our Holocaust Memorial Day is linked to the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on January the 27th, 1945. This was a difficult moment for survivors of the Holocaust. I now invite Emily Logan, Ombudsman for Children, to give her reading from Primo Levi's memoir, If This Is a Man.
So for us, even the hour of liberty rang out grave and muffled and filled our souls with joy and yet also with pain. Nothing could ever happen good and pure enough to rub out our past. The scars of the outrage would remain with us forever, in the memories of those who saw it, in the places where it occurred, and in the stories we shall tell of it.
In 1953, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority in Jerusalem, inaugurated the Righteous Among the Nations Award to recognize Gentiles who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. In 2013, Mary Elms became the first Irish person to be awarded Righteous Among the Nations for saving Jewish children in France during the Holocaust. I now invite Colin Rafter, Director of Human Rights Division at the Department of Foreign Affairs, to give the reading about the Righteous Among the Nations.
only a fraction of the Jewish people in Nazi-occupied Europe were saved. And yet, thousands of non-Jews in every country of the Third Reich voluntarily risked their lives to save Jews, putting their own families in jeopardy. There are approximately 20,000 names of the righteous listed in the Yad Vashem records, but the true number is probably double that. The story of the righteous is one of exceptional goodness that emerged in the midst of unspeakable tragedy and destruction. It is ironic that the nightmare and horrors of the Holocaust also became a defining moment of courage and decency. The righteous among the nations illustrate the Talmudic verse, "For he who saves one life is regarded as if he has saved the entire world."
The children of Holocaust survivors, of which I am one, are known as second generation. I now invite David Reichenthal to give his reading.
For many Holocaust survivors, the last sight they had of their parents and other family members was when they stepped out of the cattle cars at their final destination. For many of us, we have grown used to the very small families. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts. We have been born with the title second generation, a title that brings with it huge responsibility to our parents, to our children, and now to everyone. To keep telling their story, to learn the lessons, and to never forget.
One of our greatest challenges is teaching the lessons of the Holocaust for the future. I now invite Mrs. Catherine McGuinness to give her reading.
The Holocaust is an event that happened at the core of our civilization, the heart of our culture, and in the midst of societies resembling our own. The Holocaust was mainly about Jewish people, but its lessons are universal. So many Holocaust victims were betrayed by trust, betrayed by justice, betrayed by the pillars that uphold our very society and our way of life. The burden of damage has been passed through the generations. Our duty is clear. It is not enough to be good. We must know what to do when we face evil. It is not enough to know what we stand for. We must also know what we stand against. It is not enough to educate our own children about tolerance. We must lift the crippling burden of hate from all children in the world. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers and crematoria. It began with whispers, taunts, stereotyping, prejudice, and attitudes. The story of the Holocaust calls on us to strengthen our resolve to combat anti-Semitism in all its manifestations, to reject Holocaust denial, and to commit ourselves to challenging every example of intolerance that we witness.
In May 1995, Paddy Fitzgibbon of the Rotary Club of Listowel delivered a moving speech at the unveiling of the Holocaust Memorial in the Garden of Europe in Listowel, County Kerry. I now invite the Honourable Mrs. Susan Denham, Chief Justice, to read an extract from Paddy's speech on that occasion.
Our generation and the generation or two after us will be the last that will be able to say that we stood and shook hands of some of those who survived. go home from this place and tell your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren that today in Listowel you looked into eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic events ever unleashed by mankind upon mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered and still talked about and still wept over 10,000 years from now. Because if they are not, then there is no hope for us at all. The Holocaust happened, and it can happen again. And every one of us, if only out of our own sense of preservation, has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever occurs again.
We will now observe a minute's silence in memory of the men, women, and children who perished in the Holocaust. Could I ask you please to stand? It is traditional at Holocaust memorial events to light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Shoah. In Ireland, we also light candles in memory of other victims of Nazi atrocities. The first candles are dedicated to the memory of people with disabilities and disabling conditions who were murdered, starved to death, and forcibly sterilized by doctors and other willing helpers. I call upon Deirdre Spain of Inclusion Ireland and John Dolan, CEO of Disability Federation of Ireland, to light their candles. The next candles are in memory of millions of Poles and Slavs who were murdered, displaced, and forcibly Aryanized by the Nazis, and the thousands of members of ethnic minorities who were persecuted and murdered. I call upon Beata Malandowska, Dublin City Library, and Georgina Narmani to light their candles. The next candles are in memory of the Romani people of Europe who were rounded up, displaced, forcibly sterilized, and murdered by the Nazis. I call upon Riccardo Mantian and Bianca Paun of the Roma community to light their candles. The next candles are in memory of homosexual men and women who were persecuted and murdered because of their sexual orientation. I call upon Daniel Zagorski and Raz Sheridan of Belong To light their candles. The next candles are in memory of the political victims of the Nazis, socialists, communists, trade unionists, Democrats, and other anti-Nazi organizations. I call upon Manas O'Riordan, Ireland Secretary of the International Brigade Memorial Trust, and Lawrence Bond of the Equality Authority to light their candles.
The next candles are in memory of Christian victims of all denominations, including Jehovah's Witnesses, who were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis. I call upon Louise O'Sullivan of Loretto Sisters and Kathy Hallisey, Taney Parish, to light their candles. We dedicate 6 candles to the memory of the 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children, who were annihilated in the Holocaust by the Nazis and their collaborators. Jews were gassed and burned to ashes in the death camps. Jews died of starvation and maltreatment in the concentration camps, slave labor camps, transit camps, and deportation camps. Jews perished from cold, hunger, and disease in the ghettos. Jews were murdered in their homes. Jews were clubbed to death in the streets. Jews were hanged and shot. Jews were hunted down and massacred in the forests. Jews were machine gunned in ravines. Jews were buried alive in pits they dug themselves. Jews were slaughtered in gas vans. Jews were mutilated during horrific medical experiments. Those lighting candles in memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are children and grandchildren of Holocaust victims and survivors, 2nd and 3rd generation. All our candle lighters lost countless members of their families who perished in the Holocaust. I call upon Brenda Borchardt, whose grandparents Chatzkel Abram and Belia Abram and many family members perished in the Holocaust. Mark Heinbach, whose grandparents Heinrich Heinbach and Selma Heinbach and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Emma Zinn Collis, whose father Zoltan and aunt Edith survived Bergen-Belsen and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Marina Herbst, in memory of the many members of the Herbst and Korn families who perished in the Holocaust. Joe Katz, whose mother Frida survived Auschwitz and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. And Dina Kaplan, whose grandfather Raphael Orbach survived Buchenwald and Theresienstadt and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. We will always remember. I now invite Rabbi Zalman Lent and Cantor Olwyn Schulman of the Irish Jewish community to read the Jewish prayer for the repose of the souls of the departed El Malei Rachamim in English and in Hebrew. Could I ask you please to stand?
O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the sheltering wings of your divine presence for the souls of all the holy, pure, and innocent who were murdered by the Nazis. We now pray for the souls of the victims. May their resting places be in the Garden of Eden. And so may the Master of mercy shelter them for eternity with the cover of his wings, and may he bind their souls in a bond of eternal life. May the Lord be their inheritance, and may they repose in peace upon their heavenly resting places. And let us say, Amen.
Ele male rachamim, shochein b'meromim, hamtzei menucha nechona, al kanefei hashechina, b'ma'alot kedoshim u'teharim, b'ma'alot kedoshim u'teharim, kezar harakia, meirim u'mazhirim. Lenishmot rivevot alefei Yisrael, anashim nashim vataf, sheneherigu ושנשחטו, שננחנקו, ושנשרפו, ושנקברו חיים, על קידוש השם. בעל הרחמים, יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור החיים את נשמתם, וגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר Amen.
The Holocaust showed us how science that can heal was used to kill. The Holocaust showed us how education that can enlighten was used to pervert moral standards. The Holocaust showed us how the bureaucracy that sustains modern life was used as the machinery of mass deaths. The Holocaust showed us how easily civilized people slipped into the brutal genocide of the Jewish people. As our annual Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration draws to a close, we owe it to the victims of the Holocaust, to the survivors of the Holocaust, and to ourselves. Jew, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, humanist, believer, non-believer, black, white, from whatever religious, ethnic, cultural, or political persuasion, to rededicate ourselves to truly eradicating intolerance from our midst. We must rededicate ourselves to drowning out the voices that seek to deny that the catastrophe we call the Shoah ever happened. We must rededicate ourselves to preventing the memory of the Shoah being cynically distorted by a vicious campaign that seeks to deny the Jewish people their past and their future. My friends, thank you for joining us in this evening of solemn commemoration.